Next is Denise Allen, curator at the Frick Collection. The creator of two fabulous exhibitions there. First, Riccio, a couple of years ago, and now Antico. And on top of the scholarship that she brings to the subjects, Denise has an unerring eye for placement. These are ideal installations of these poetic bronzes. And one thing about Denise that I adore, one of many, is her insistence always on the poetry in a work of art.
Well, thank you, Jim, for that introduction, and thanks both to Jim Draper and Katja Brandt for having invited me to speak. I think that this conference has taught us that the bright core of what we become is forged by what we learn in our youth. So I'd like to say to Katja, if there's anything good in the work, then thank you. I'm making use of this occasion to encourage you to take advantage of an unrepeatable opportunity to view and consider 3 exhibitions in New York that together present the creative reception of antiquity at the dawn of the High Renaissance. The first is Antico, the Golden Age of Renaissance bronzes, now showing at the Frick. The second is Antico's beautiful Spinario, a recent gift of Mrs. Charles Reitzman that was put on display in these galleries just 2 weeks ago. And finally, Michelangelo's Archer, the sculpture that has brought us all together here today. At left is one of Antico's earliest surviving statuettes, a bronze reduction of the Apollo Belvedere that he completed by 1496. Antico and Michelangelo both worked in Rome in the 1490s, but they are rarely discussed together, with 2 significant exceptions: Luke Syson's and Dora Thornton's remarkable book, Objects of Virtue, and Lori Fusco and Gino Corti's magisterial Lorenzo de Medici as Collector and Antiquarian. What I would like to do today is follow their lead and consider the creative, informed eclecticism that unites both sculptors' approach to the antique during the late Quattrocento. To think about the ways that Antico and Michelangelo combined ancient and modern artistic and literary sources to create a fresh, unified vision of antiquity that reflects the impulses of their particular cultural moment. To do this in less than 30 minutes is, of course, impossible. But what I will offer are some observations from my recent engagement with the art of Antico and my attempts to understand The Archer as a youthful work by Michelangelo. I want to stress that I am seizing the opportunity of this conference to throw out preliminary ideas against the background provided by an audience of experts. Before I begin, I will give you an overview of Antico's works, for I assume in this audience, or almost any other audience for that matter, he will be less well known than Michelangelo. Born around 1455 in Mantua, Pier Jacopo Alare Bonacolsi, better known as Antico, probably trained as a goldsmith. He was court sculptor to the Gonzaga, rulers of Mantua, and he exclusively worked for them, making sculptures in precious metal and bronze until his death in 1528. None of Antico's goldsmith's work survives. Only the bronzes remain. These are Antico's most important patrons. At left are Antico's medallic portraits of Gianfrancesco Gonzaga and his wife, Antonia dal Balzo. Antico served their court until Gianfrancesco's death in 1496. At center is Mantegna's portrait of the young Ludovico Gonzaga from the Camera Picta in Mantua. Antico worked for Bishop Ludovico from 1496 until 1511. And you see the very young Ludovico as an adolescent at the far right. Lastly, at the very far right, is Isabella d'Este, Antico's principal 16th-century patron. For the Gonzaga, Antico acted as a consultant on the purchase of antiquities, and he restored classical Roman marble statuary. His profound knowledge of ancient sculpture earned him the name Antico, or the Antique One. Although Antico is first documented in Rome in 1497, This visit must have been preceded by other stays in the city. One of the most compelling documents of Antico's Roman sojourn is this signature at the bottom, Anticus Mantuanus reficit, or Antico the Mantuan remade this, which he carved on the pier beneath the monumental marble horse tamers on the Quirinal Hill. Antico probably signed the statue to commemorate his restoration of it, and his signature links him with the ancient sculptors Praxiteles and Phidias, who were believed to have carved the group. Sometime in the early 1490s, Antico studied the Apollo Belvedere, which had been unearthed in 1489 and was displayed in the sculpture garden of Cardinal Giuliano della Rovere in Rome. For the Gonzaga, Antico created this exquisite bronze reduction of the Apollo. Antico's Apollo is the very first artistic response to the celebrated ancient Roman statue. By the early 16th century, Antico had created a gallery in miniature of Rome's most admired ancient bronze and marble statuary for his Gonzaga patrons. The monumental fragmentary marbles of the Meleager, at left the seated nymph, and the Hercules and Antaeus were transformed by Antico into exquisite small-scale statuettes. The statues of Venus Felix, the Spinadio, and the Marcus Aurelius, which symbolize the glories of the ancient city, were similarly transformed by Antico's hand. Antico's first patron, Gianfrancesco Gonzaga, was a renowned collector of ancient coins, and these works profoundly influenced the artist's approach to the antique. Antico united the image of Gianfrancesco's rulership with the august heritage of imperial Rome, using the language of ancient coins. At top left is Antico's portrait medal of Gianfrancesco with the obverse and reverse compared to a Sestertius of Caligula below. At far right is Antico's large rondel of Hercules slaying the Lernaean Hydra. Below it is a Roman coin that served as its model. The last genre which Antico developed was the bronze portrait bust, depicting ancient gods and historical figures. At left is Antico's bronze portrait of a young man. At right, the Antonine marble that served as its model. Other of Antico's busts, like the Cleopatra, have no ancient sources, or sources in classical sculpture. They are instead imaginary interpretations of antiquity, first envisioned by the Gonzaga court painter Andrea Mantegna. And Marietta Cambareri, who will speak next, was the first to really emphasize this point. Because Antico's art is generally hews so closely to its antique sources, he is rightly associated with a philological approach to antiquity. His art parallels the Renaissance humanist enterprise to rid classical texts of their medieval errors and to achieve an accurate classical structure, clarity, and beauty in their own writing. Through an equally rigorous and profound understanding of his ancient sources, Antico created his works in a convincingly classical mode. In this, Antico remains a quintessentially 15th century artist, but we have yet to plumb the depths of how intelligently creative Antico was. A case in point is Antico's Cupid at left, a bronze created around the time of Michelangelo's Archer. Laurie Fusco has proposed that the ancient marble Cupid at right may have come from Rome to Lorenzo the Magnificent's collection in 1489, and she also suggests that it is the model for Antico's bronze. I am not sure if this is correct, but I am sure that the comparison between the two works underscores Antico's inventive prowess. It is worth considering how Antico conceives an ancient deity who is celebrated by classical and Renaissance poets for his ability to vanquish gods and men through the power of all-conquering love. Like the god of ancient myth, Antico's Cupid beguiles his victims with his beauty and apparent vulnerability. Everything about this immaculately realized bronze entices the viewer to approach: the softly rounded body and the golden locks of hair tied up in an archer's topknot. The fluttering naturalistic wings, so like those of a fledgling bird's. Of course, when we approach Cupid this closely, we place ourselves directly in his line of fire. and we too fall hapless victims to his power. Antico's witty conceit is as elegantly refined as his sculpture, and it must have been appreciated by his sophisticated courtly audience, who were well versed in Cupid's poetic lore. I wonder if Antico's Cupid might tell us something about Michelangelo's Archer, a work for which there is also no direct precedent in ancient sculpture, and whose subject, according to 16th-century sources, could either be Apollo or Cupid. Should we not trust Michelangelo's personal biographer Condivi, who says that the statue is the god of love? Consider the archer's attributes. Like Lorenzo's ancient Cupid, Michelangelo's archer stares upward, preparing to launch an arrow into the air. The archer's lack of wings should not trouble us. As a youth, Michelangelo hid the equine bodies of centaurs, and he edited out angels' wings whenever he could throughout his life. The archer's other uncommon attributes, the lion's paw quiver, and the vase recorded in Ango's drawing, might be found in ancient texts well known to Poliziano, Michelangelo's humanist mentor, as well as to Michelangelo's erudite patrons in Florence and Rome. As a source for the lion skin quiver, we need look no further than the Greek anthology, where Cupid is often celebrated in epigrammic verse as a deity who has the power to vanquish even the strongest gods and to steal their attributes. Hercules' lion skin is one of Cupid's prizes. The archer's other attribute, the vase, may evoke Apuleius. His legend of Cupid and Psyche was popular at the time. In this tale of star-crossed lovers, Cupid dips his arrows into two vases containing waters drawn from twin fountains in Venus's garden. One fountain is bitter, its waters reject love. The other's sweet waters embrace it. Cupid accidentally pierces himself with one of his sweetly tainted arrows and falls victim to his own power. Love indeed conquers all. Like Antico statuettes, Michelangelo's Archer is intended to ravish the viewer with its beauty and its moments of exquisite naturalism, like the movement of tender flesh across the abdomen and the delicately described ribs. The statue similarly invites witty questions. From which vase has Cupid dipped his arrows, the bitter or the sweet? And when the arrow is launched, where will love's dart inevitably strike? This is by no means an interpretation, but only a suggestion that ancient texts, and popular ones at that, might provide the framework for understanding the subject of Michelangelo's statue, and that they might be further explored. And yesterday, Professor Hankins happily rendered this entire argument redundant, but I'm very happy. But I still think that specifically the Paludian anthology might trump the Neo-Latin poets as a literary source for Michelangelo's Archer. Now, the obvious classical sculptural sources for Antico statuettes tends to obscure the importance of literary sources, if not in their making, then certainly in their reception. As an example is the Hercules and Antaeus, a bronze statuette that Antico based on the much-admired fragmentary ancient Roman marble at Rite that depicts the hero Hercules heaving the giant Antaeus into the air and breaking his back against his shoulder. It is an extraordinary reconstruction of an ancient marble that in Antico's day was missing its legs and, significantly, the giant Antaeus' head. The agony of Antaeus' expression is Antico's invention, and the figure's compelling dramatic force evokes an epigram from the Paludian anthology in praise of the original ancient bronze. And I quote it here: "Who molded this bronze that groans, and by the power of his art thus figured effort and daring? The statue is alive, and I pity the giant in distress, and shudder at Hercules the bold and mighty. For he holds Antaeus sore pressed by the grip of his hands, and the giant doubled up seems even to be groaning." Antico's creative rethinking of the classical past includes the newest artistic discoveries. I remind you that Antico is the first artist known to have interpreted the Apollo Belvedere, a fact that underscores his ambition and his interest in incorporating the most novel classical finds into his art. And this leads me to tentatively suggest an ancient source for one of Antico's most beautiful reliefs. Hercules slaying the Lernaean Hydra, a monstrous creature whose snake-like heads grew back each time they were lopped off. According to myth, one of the heads was immortal, and Antico shows this by endowing the creature with an anguished human face that contrasts with the mindless vitality of the snakes and endows the monster with a conscious response to pain and death. We cannot help but empathize with the creature's pathos as it is destroyed by the impassive hero. Eleonora Luciano has demonstrated that Antico derived this composition from the reverses of ancient coins. But in coins, the Hydra lacks a human face, and as far as I know, Antico is the only Renaissance artist to have depicted the Hydra with one. I wonder if Antico's invention might have been inspired by a new discovery, an ancient manuscript of Virgil's Aeneid that we know was in Rome by the second decade of the 16th century when it appears in Raphael's school prints. Antico's relief provides a hint that perhaps the manuscript may have been in Rome by the late 15th century. In the so-called Vatican Virgil, which you see here, here is a diagram after it from Natur und Antike, the exhibition catalog. In the so-called Vatican Virgil, the Hydra with a human face appears guarding the gates of Hades. It is the only instance of this in classical art that I know. It is intriguing that the Hydra is the most damaged part of the manuscript. It would have presented just the right challenge to Antico, who specialized in reconstructing classical works. If he did, then from this worn image, he created a dramatically charged and emotionally moving and classically correct narrative moment. This next example also emphasizes that Antico's approach to the antique is much more insightfully creative than he is generally credited to be. This is the bust of the young Hercules from Wilton House that Jeremy Warren discovered and attributed to Antico about 2 years ago. The lion's pelt draped around the hero's neck identifies the bust as Hercules. No ancient sculptural precedent exists for Antico's haunting conception of Hercules as a tender youth whose introspective expression evokes his lifelong struggles and trials along the path to virtue. Antico's bust results from a magisterial combination of ancient sources. The attribute of a miniature lion's pelt draped around the neck derives from the conventions of ancient coins depicting Hercules, like the one at right. Antico modeled the head itself after a sculpture that was undoubtedly a Roman marble after a 5th century Greek athlete. Hercules' clean profile, heavy jaw, and hairstyle evoke the world of Phidias and the Parthenon. Antico has freely adapted his sculptural source. Though the hairstyle conforms to the Greek athlete type, a colleague has noted that Antico renders it with the exuberant Roman curls that are characteristic of his art. As you see here, in Antico's bust of the Emperor Antoninus Pius from the Met at center, and the bust from the Liechtenstein collection at far right. Anne Allison and Davide Gasparotto convincingly have identified the Liechtenstein bust as Alexander the Great. It also has no ancient prototype. They have argued that it results from Antico's deeply considered combination of classical sources that should now remind us of the young Hercules. A trove of classical inspiration that has not been mined deeply enough for its influence on Antico's art is ancient coins. Coins were as important to the composition of Antico sculpture as were the ancient statues that he studied in Rome. Antico derived his knowledge of ancient coins from Gianfrancesco's vast collection, which comprised over 2,000 examples. Eleonora Luciano has recently highlighted the importance of ancient coins as the source for Antico's rondels of the labors of Hercules, finding 2 precedents for the 4 reliefs that are securely attributed to Antico. I would like to complete that group. You see the reliefs with their ancient numismatic prototypes below. The Hercules and Nemean lion, and the Hercules and the Hydra, the Hercules and the Erymanthean boar, and the Hercules with the Chernian hind. As an aside, I'd like to note that the infant Hercules strangling serpents is the one relief in the Rondel series that is stylistically inconsistent with Antico's production. It is also significantly the only relief in the series that lacks an ancient numismatic precedent. Antico's deliberate quotation of ancient coins for the labors of Hercules was in the service of much more than antiquarian accuracy. In the late 15th century secular courts of Florence, Ferrara, and Mantua, Hercules was the ancient Roman symbol of the virtues of rulership. This point was driven home by Andrea Mantegna, whose depiction of Rome in the Camera Picta shows the gateway to the eternal city commanded by a colossal marble statue of Hercules. Antico's rendition of the demigod exists in 4 versions. You see it on the left, one of them, more than any other of Antico's surviving statuettes, probably for this reason. The Gonzaga's association of Hercules with rulership is clearly expressed in the language of ancient coins. As illustrated here by this imperial Roman aureus, where Hercules emblematizes Augustan virtues, or virtuti Augusti. Since the time of Petrarch, the depiction of emperors on ancient coins were esteemed as examples of princely virtues. And I think it is no accident that the obverse of the coin Antico used to compose the relief of the Chernian hind depicts a portrait of the Emperor Antoninus Pius. The deeds of Hercules are quite common on the reverses of Antoninus's coinage. His designation Pius indicates his Renaissance status as an emperor worthy of emulation. In an outsized way, Antico's bronze bust and Hercules' rondel make the connection with the virtues of rulership that are displayed in miniature and of a piece on ancient coins. Antico's knowledgeable combination of a wide variety of antique sources, regardless of their medium or scale, characterize him as a late 15th century artist. And his sensitivity to the broad meaning of his sources may help us to find a context for some of his works. I bring up Antico's problematic Gonzaga urn, a masterpiece whose iconography and dating have thus far eluded cogent explanation. The urn is embellished with the mottos and emblems of Gianfrancesco Gonzaga and Antonia del Balzo, Antico's first patrons, which hang from the garland suspended from the urn's shoulder. The lid of the urn is decorated with a complex frieze of military trophies celebrating Gianfrancesco's martial achievements. These are capped with a canthus leaf ornament, which originally terminated in a lost finial at the top. Round the urn's base is a sea triumph led by Neptune, who is accompanied by a procession of amorous tritons and nereids. The exuberant behavior of the sea deities, in conjunction with Gianfrancesco and Antonia's combined emblems, have led Anne Ellison to propose that the urn was made to celebrate the couple's marriage in 1479. Other scholars have pointed out that there are 2 problems with this conclusion. First, there is no tradition of commissioning nuptial trophy vases, and secondly, the style of the urn is much more in keeping with the end of the 15th century, at the very least. Recently, Eleonore Luciano has convincingly suggested that the appearance of Antonia del Balzo's motto, "My Pew," is consistent with dating the urn to 1487 or later. What no one has considered is the classical form of the urn itself, and how this might relate to its meaning, purpose, and date. This is a significant question because Renaissance bronze functional objects made in the antique mode tend to announce their meaning through the ancient forms that they emulate. Such an example is provided by Ricciot's oil lamp at the Frick at right. Although the lamp's decoration is extremely complex, its overall message is simple and direct. Closely deriving from ancient bronze oil lamps, like the one at left, Renaissance lamps emblematize the concept of eternity. The reliefs on Ricciot's lamp figuratively underscore this concept. So we should ask, is there a meaningful ancient model for the Gonzaga urn? I think so. In its overall configuration, the Gonzaga urn closely resembles ancient Roman marble cinerary urns, like this example from the Walters Museum. Both have covers that terminate in a finial. Elaborate masks decorate both urns' shoulders. Their forms slope downward to a narrow, rather pointed cup. And both top-heavy containers are supported by a delicate round foot. The inscription of the deceased on the cinerary urn is in the same location as Gianfrancesco and Antonia's emblems and mottos on the Gonzaga urn. The covers of Roman cinerary urns were clamped with lead to permanently seal them. The Walters example still retains these clamps above the masks. The Gonzaga urn's cover is also permanently sealed, for it is cast in one piece with the body of the vessel. This fact is made visually explicit by the masks and the harpies whose heads overlap or seal the join of the vessel with its cover, as you see here and then here. I am not suggesting that the Gonzaga urn was functional. What I am proposing is that the all'antica form of the Gonzaga urn announces the concept of eternity, just as does the fact that it is made of bronze, a material that, according to ancient sources, is the most enduring of all. The Gonzaga and Antico were keenly aware of this fact. Antico fashioned silver vases for Gianfrancesco, and they, like his statuettes in silver and gold, were melted down periodically to pay debts. Works in precious metal were ephemeral. Bronze, however, survives. The concept of eternity is reinforced by the sea triumph that appears at the base of the urn. This, too, is a funereal motif that Renaissance artists studied and adapted from ancient Roman sarcophagi, like this famous one much copied in the late 15th century. The urn is a commemorative object. Its all'antica form and the lusty sea triumph at its base celebrate the perpetual vitality of Gianfrancesco's and Antonia's rulership. But for what specific purpose was the urn made? The urn does not appear in Gianfrancesco's exhaustive death inventory of 1496, but his wife, Antonia, lived well on into the 16th century. Antonia fostered Antico's early career, and after her husband's death, she jointly held court with his brother, Bishop Ludovico, at Bozzolo. Could Antonia, as a widow, have commissioned the urn posthumously to commemorate she and her husband's dynasty and rule? Now, I do not want to end this talk with a dangling question, so in the remaining moments, I would like to briefly consider how late Quattrocento artists creatively moved from one medium to another. The ability to transfer skills at design across media is most often associated with those, like Antico, who were trained as goldsmiths. Their mastery of design was predicated on their knowledge of how to work in diverse sorts of materials on any scale, whether large or small. Thus, Antonio Pollaiolo, for example, who was trained as a goldsmith, could design and execute the monumental bronze tomb of Pope Innocent VIII, completed in 1492, while Antico was engaged with designing and executing a miniaturized bronze version of the Marcus Aurelius. Now, in scholars' discussion of goldsmiths as masters of design, emphasis is usually given to design itself rather than to execution. That is, to the creative ideation of a work rather than to its making and finishing. There are many reasons for this emphasis, but the most obvious one is practical. Few examples of figurative goldsmiths' work from the period survive, and those few that do are very difficult to study closely. In these closing moments, I would like you to consider how remarkably Antico transferred his hands-on goldsmith skills into the enduring medium of bronze. And we'll do this by comparing details from Antico's statuettes with Cellini's golden salt cellar. The chasing and burnishing of Meleager's hair has all the sparkling reflection of the Neptunes from Cellini's salt. The bronze's velvety black matte patina, which was Antico's invention, serves as an all'antica substitute for the delicate wire brushing that creates a similar matte surface on the gold figure. Both matte surfaces reduce bright reflection and scatter light to emphasize the softly rounded forms of living flesh. Antico inscribes each hair of Hercules' lion pelt into the bronze metal with the same naturalistic intensity as Cellini gives to the hairs on the body of his golden seahorse. And Antico renders closely observed tiny details like the bunched pin feathers on Cupid's wings and the long feathers' separate filaments with the same skill as Cellini describes the horse's mane, its ruff, and its scales. Each of Antico's extraordinary gilded sculptures reveal the mind and the hand of a master goldsmith. What his achievement has to tell us about the lost work of 15th century goldsmiths, as well as 16th century goldsmiths' work in sculpture, is a topic, I think, that is yet to be fully explored. Thank you.